Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and welcome to this special edition of The Heat. As part of the new reality of broadcasting during the coronavirus pandemic, I'm joining you via Zoom from my home just outside Washington, D.C., instead of our regular CGTN studio. Joining me now on the program from Hong Kong, James Chow is the WHO Goodwill Ambassador and host of China Current. And from Ann Arbor, Michigan, Doug Guthrie is a former senior director of Apple in Shanghai, China. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks for having us.
James, let me start with you. Hong Kong has managed to keep the number of people infected with coronavirus relatively low using a very aggressive strategy of testing, tracing, and isolation. What is the situation like in the city right now?
Well, Anand, I think things are getting better. We're hearing that in a couple of days, restrictions may be eased off slightly, meaning that more venues might be able to open up again, and some semblance of the businesses and services that we've got used to will be available all over again. We still don't quite know yet when schools reopen, and I always think that's going to be the bellwether of how open this new post-COVID era will be. But I think what's happening in Hong Kong is being done very carefully in staggered, careful stages so that we don't get a surge of large densities of people and therefore the risk of further waves of infections. But I think the most important thing here is that people are still very much emotionally and mentally traumatized by the events of almost 20 years ago when we had an outbreak of SARS. It was very much concentrated in Hong Kong. And I think the lessons that learned then have put people on their guard very quickly this time around.
So James, what are the kinds of businesses that are now being allowed to reopen in Hong Kong?
Well, I can't get a facial, can't get a manicure. If you go to restaurants now, instead of being takeaway only, you now have restaurants and more people allowed into restaurants. So if, for example, you go to a fast food joint just down the road from where I am right now, before you could only order takeout, you'd need to wear a mask. You still need to, even just to get in. They will check your temperature at the entrance, so before you take a step onto their property. But more and more people are being allowed to dine in, and they're able to do that not only through the policies that governments are allowing them to do, but also they're installing these plastic dividers, these thick plastic dividers, so that even if I was sitting opposite you, for example, there won't be, or there'll be a reduced risk of droplets from one to the other while we eat our food.
Doug Guthrie, looking at the broad economic picture for China, the economic growth outlook is sharply down. It's just over 1%. This is a country that was doing, Doug, about 6%, just over 6% not so long ago. What kind of impact is this not only going to have on China, but on the global economy?
Well, and I think it's important to distinguish between those two things. Let me talk first about China. So in the case of China, I'm a little more optimistic than the most dour predictions. I think, I really follow economists like Justin Lin and others who are pretty close to what the central government is doing and saying. And so you're right that growth has dropped this quarter dramatically. It looks to me like they're still going to hit numbers between 3 and 4% for 2020, which if you think about 3% for the second largest economy in the world in the wake of a major crisis, it's not quite as bad as it sounds. The other thing that's important to realize and remember about China is the way China does stimulus is through investment in infrastructure. And that has certain dangers with it because of things like debt to GDP ratio. But, it's the kind of thing that Beijing can put its thumb on the scale of growth pretty easily if it wants to. And they will. So my guess is that they're going to come in at 3 to 4% for the year. And then by 2021, assuming no major boomerang on the COVID-19 crisis, I think that things are going to be back to what their goals are. For the global economy, I think it's a bigger question. And this has to do with how other economies are going to be tied into service economies and what they do. But just speaking specifically about the impact of China on the global economy, my guess or my feeling based on what my research team is telling me in China is that the manufacturing supply chain is for the most part going to rebound. But there's going to be a big difference between light industry goods and more complex manufacturing. Light industry goods, it's unclear like what's going to happen because those industries can move pretty quickly. And if they decide to go somewhere else besides China, they can. In China, for complex manufacturing like electronics or automobiles or batteries or these industries are married to China. The complexity of the supply chain there just cannot go anywhere. And so it's, my guess is that for those industries, manufacturing is going to pick up again and it's going to be fine. And the impact on the global economy, again, there's going to be an impact no matter what, but it's going to be less than we might think.
James, there's also been a big diplomatic fallout from this coronavirus outbreak. China is facing accusations from the United States, from President Trump, more recently from Australia as well, that it didn't do enough, that it concealed information at the beginning. The US is even calling for reparations right now, or some kind of damage payment. How is China responding to that?
Well, I don't think anyone would know how to respond because we're still in the middle of a pandemic. And even though Wuhan has been officially declared virus-free, this is a country that can't afford to let its guard down. This is where the first outbreak was discovered, if you look at Wuhan as the epicenter, but with cases around the country. So I think it's important not to get distracted. There's a lot of political rhetoric going on. And over on the China Current, we started our special coverage on COVID-19 back in the end of January. And very early on, we had a story about healthcare workers and the compassion and the kindness that we as civilians often take for granted, our first responders. Now our life depends on them. And another video we did, which I think was particularly revealing, is that we've got to keep politics out of health. This is not a bargaining chip. This is not an asset that can be offered up. This is not something on the store shelf that you can buy and sell at will. This is a pandemic that has brought us to our knees, that has humbled us, and there should be a battle cry around the world. What I find quite disappointing and what saddens me so much is, and sometimes angers me, is to see us as fellow members of humanity fighting against each other. And I do want to go quickly back to my last response because I don't want it to sound glib about not getting facials or not being able to go for other beauty treatments. That's not what I'm saying here. What I'm saying here is that lockdowns happen when governments don't take precautionary measures earlier on, when they choose to ignore advice from medical experts like the World Health Organization. This is what happens. And Anna and I spoke to Jeffrey Sachs, the economist, a couple of days ago at his home outside of New York. And he was saying the same thing. If you don't focus on case, if you don't focus on quarantine, if you don't focus on testing and treatment and isolation and mobilization of community leaders, you're going to be stuck with the last option, or what should be the last resort, which is locking down your economies, a very, very costly approach. And how are you going to safely exit this? We haven't really found a model yet, a working model yet, of a country that's gone into a thick lockdown, not a country like New Zealand because it didn't have to, and then safely retreat out of it with the economy, but more importantly, Anna, with the people's health intact. That has to be the priority here.
Doug, I want to get back to some of the points you raised there. And, you gave us a pretty optimistic picture of a 3 to 4% growth rate in China. But we are also hearing from many countries around the world that they want to lessen their dependence on China, lessen their dependence on China's manufacturing capacity. What impact will that have on Chinese industry?
Well, I mean, this is an interesting topic just because the real question for me is, can they? And so the interesting thing about China's supply chain, and the reason I made the distinction a few minutes ago between light industry goods and more complex manufacturing, China has a couple advantages that no other country in the world has, bar none, including India. I mean, we often think about like, oh, well, companies are in China because of the deep, cheap labor force. And yes, there is a big labor force of a lot of people who will work for cheap, but that's only one piece of what's really makes China so powerful as a manufacturing supply chain. And I would point to three other things. The first is the migrant labor force. So the floating population is a really, really important juggernaut for China. So there's a population of about 275 million people that float around the country. And they basically allow for what we might think of as seasonal labor, but in complex manufacturing. And so this is a huge thing that no other country has, because it allows for companies, whatever company in whichever industry, to actually hire ramp up hiring when production goes up, and tamp down hiring when it goes down. And all global markets work in a seasonal way, not just agriculture. And so China has that. The second thing is China has a massive vocationally trained technical labor force. So if you want a whole group of migrant laborers to come into a factory, whether it's Foxconn or any other, you can use that cheap labor, but there have to be technically trained people to oversee lines. And so it's a different thing than most other countries have, including countries like the United States. So when Donald Trump just talks about we should just bring manufacturing back to the United States, not only do we not have the cheap labor force, we also don't have the vocational technical trained labor force. The third thing that China has is an amazingly integrated infrastructural system so that things can flow around the country. So it's just hard for me to see on and how, I get the sentiment like we should reduce our dependence on China, but that manufacturing supply chain is just such a juggernaut right now. It's hard for me to see how that would happen quickly.
But just one other point on that, Doug, and that is, China might regain its output, its productive capability, but economies around the world have been hit by this coronavirus. I'm just wondering if there is a fall in demand, foreign demand that is, how that will impact China.
I mean, it is a great question. And so you look at any country that has a massive output from production that's happening in China. I mean, everybody's going to suffer around the world. And so these are, companies from Tesla to companies in electronics and so of course that will have an impact on China's productivity and the amount of production that the manufacturing supply chain goes through, which is why I would say, even if China rebounds to 5 to 6% growth, which they can do through infrastructural growth, we're still going to see, remnants of this crisis for years to come for everybody, and China included.
James, what are your thoughts on the Chinese economy and the outlook for the future?
Well, actually, I think, Anand, listening to Doug, obviously, he's making the point that there's certain advantages that other countries and economies may not be able to replicate. But I think it's actually to China's advantage that there is more competition. First of all, should there be another wave, or let's hope not, perhaps another global health emergency, so I think we're pretty sure that one's going to happen in some due course. China, if it's caught up in the thick of it all over again, will also need supplies coming from elsewhere. As we all know from the basic laws of economics, that competition increases choice. And I think it will also push up the level over in China. Right now, the competition is over what we desperately need in personal protective equipment, whether it be face masks and ventilators. And that doesn't need to be confined from the manufacturing bases of one country. If China finds itself in that position, I'm sure they'll hope that they had other supplies coming in from elsewhere. So I actually think that this is going to be an opportunity to recalibrate our thinking. No one is stopping the rest of the world in participating, but we also have to remember that this is yet another sign that our economies are interconnected because our world is interconnected as well. So when one suffers, the other one's going to feel some pain, as Doug, I think, pointed out very clearly.
Doug, there was one other point, and that is the New York Times published a piece overnight in which it said that Chinese factories are back, but its consumers are not. How would that impact major American corporations like Apple, for instance? China's a huge market for Apple.
Yeah. So China's a huge market for Apple and many other companies. And so, everybody needs to kind of be concerned about the consumption-based economy. However, the bigger issue for me is more about this critical moment that China stands at, which is the transition from investment-led growth to consumption-led growth. So if you think about China's phases, export-led development, investment-led development, consumption-led growth, this last phase is really, really critical, and it's important because this is where countries fall into what they call the middle income trap, where labor costs get too high and you don't have a consumption-based economy, and so the economy just can't continue to function. So I worry less for China. I worry less about what's going to happen with foreign manufacturers that are operating there, and more about what's happening to the small scale consumption-based businesses that really have become the engine of this growth over the last 6 years. It's really one of the smart things that Xi Jinping, for all of the things you might think about him, he's been very smart at co-opting the high-tech industry and creating them as the biggest investment companies in all of Asia. And so, you know, you look at the Tencents and the Alibabas of the world, they are the ones that are supporting entrepreneurship in China. And if China loses that, everybody loses, because people are just going to buy less stuff. And China's economy will suffer, but so will foreign companies that are trying to sell things in there.
James, China has managed to bring the pandemic under control. In fact, there have been no coronavirus-related deaths in the city of Wuhan in Hubei province for the past 10 days, just over a week. But there are fears being expressed by Chinese scientists and doctors that there could be a second wave.
I think that even if they didn't express that, we should always assume that there will be the threat of a second, third, fourth, fifth wave. And on top of that, perhaps other new coronaviruses that could arrive in our scene. You know, Anand, back in September in the UN General Assembly, we went there specifically with a Global Preparedness Monitoring Board to launch our first report to specifically warn that this was going to happen. We've had a warning for over 100 years from the last major influenza of 1918. We had another warning with SARS. We had other warnings of MERS. We had other warnings with the resurgence of Ebola. So it puzzles me as to countries that stand by and say that they didn't hear anything over the last 2 months, let alone did you not hear anything for the past century. I think going forward that China needs to be very, very careful. And there was always that concern of how it was going to exit that lockdown in Wuhan, which has been a number of weeks now and apparently seems to have been going quite well. I think the lockdown offered the world a template in how to deal with an emergency, but it also offered proof that even after an epidemic breaks out, it can still be contained and then dial back to what we've seen recently to near zero or zero cases over here. But I think, as you said there, they had to be very, very careful, especially when you look at the geography of China, touching onto other countries like Russia, up in the northeast of China, provinces like Jilin are bordering over there. They need to be careful because other countries are beginning to catch up where China was, say, 3-4 months ago. And again, we live in this interconnected world. The World Health Organization was roundly criticized for not recommending travel bans. But it has to be said, it did not recommend travel bans if you follow the other public health measures. For example, in Asia, we are strong in thermal screening at airports. Those desks are always open. There's someone there either taking your manual thermal scan, or there is an automatic device that detects and stops you if you're running a fever. Basic measures like these need to be introduced at entry and exit ports all around the world. I think right now, to be fair, the weak link happens to be the developed economies in Western Europe and the United States. But I think where places like Hong Kong and mainland China and Singapore, for example, and South Korea are better, it's not because we're better than anybody else. It's because we learned these very painful lessons 2 decades ago. But we don't want anyone else learning the hard way. We want them to learn from us so they don't have to experience the same hardship.
James Cha, Doug Guthrie, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And please stay with us. You're watching The Heat.
In a world that's constantly moving, what is it that really defines us? Is it the ideas of our time or the trends that shape our lives? Full Frame, weekly on CGTN America.
Welcome back. The coronavirus outbreak continues to ravage the United States, with indigenous communities among those hardest hit by the pandemic. Roberto Borrero is president of the United Confederation of Taino People and chief of the Guainia Taino tribe. He joins me from Buffalo in New York. Chief Borrero, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Native Americans have been particularly hard hit by this virus outbreak. According to one report, they are 10 times as likely as other groups to be infected on a per capita basis. What is your assessment of the situation?
Well, from what I've seen, COVID-19 and its impact on Indigenous peoples is very serious in that not only their health are affected, but the situation also highlights the vulnerability to Indigenous communities and the inequalities that we face. So we have economic impacts, social impacts, and just the data disparity alone is something that we can highlight as, many reports are coming from what's happening in reservations, but probably about 70% of Native peoples don't live on reservations. So you have an influx of people in cities and other areas that don't get counted. And then you also have a disparity with federally recognized tribes. There's over 573 of those. There's also state recognized tribes where we don't have the same type of data. And then there's a whole host of unrecognized Indigenous peoples who also reside. So this makes it very hard to track, but it is serious.
So those inequalities that you talk about that's aggravating the situation, could you tell us something about them?
Well, just for an example, some reports coming out from tribal leaders highlight that the limited healthcare capacity that exists for their citizens currently. So the crisis like this can really overburden the existing infrastructure. So there's reports that are documenting inadequate testing, short supplies. Of course, there's in many reservations and amongst many Indigenous peoples communities, we find that some are amongst the poorest of the poor. So again, access to healthcare, the distance of travel for some rural communities, maybe some language barriers, cultural barriers, all of these things can really affect the way we engage a crisis like this.
What about access to healthcare? And you mentioned tests, things like testing as well.
Well, for many Native Americans who are within the federally recognized system, you have what's called the Indian Health Service. So, some of these health services are really clinics that are available maybe in the area. Again, because of the distance between some of the communities, they might not be as accessible, or those points for health service might not be as accessible. So again, this is another problem that exists. Getting people in and out to cities to get the adequate care. Some folks who are also suffering from the disproportionate effects of on the communities of, for example, diabetes and other illnesses, are also exacerbated in this type of situation.
That's right. This is a disease that preys on people with underlying illnesses. What is the situation in your tribe, the Guainia Taino?
Well, again, there's that situation of lack of data. Our tribal community, the Taino community, extended from the Caribbean islands to the southern tip of Florida. And right now, we just don't have the data to really see the effects overall. We are getting reports from community members that elders are being affected, that they don't have enough supplies, that because they've lost work or don't have access to those economic resources, these things are making it more difficult for them on the ground.
There is a very big economic impact that this virus and COVID-19 is having on people throughout the country. And I'm wondering what kind of economic impact it's having on Native Americans.
Well, the National Congress of American Indians just held a online town hall. And one of the first things that they said were that Natives were completely left out of the first two funding bills. As a matter of fact, Congress approved recently the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or the CARES Act. That act included about $8 billion for federal tribes. But right there, tribal governments, when this was being rolled out, they raced to court within the last 2 weeks because they wanted to challenge the Treasury Department's decision to make Alaska Native corporations eligible for these funds. So only just a day ago, a federal judge blocked the Treasury Department from sending these resources to these certain for-profit Native corporations.
So the money has been earmarked, but it's not coming through.
Exactly.
There's also a very high unemployment rate around the country, and I know that a lot of Native Americans derive their income from casinos. Casinos have now been forced to shut down. What kind of impact does that have?
Well, that $8 billion that I just mentioned from the CARES Act, that isn't available for the lost revenue that tribes have experienced. So that is a major problem. So some of the tribal leaders have suggested that Congress should allow them to use those funds to cover lost revenue, according to those leaders. But, casinos are not the only source of income for Native American peoples. I think that's probably a misnomer. It is an important economic process for many tribes. Many don't even have that. So, we really have to look at the disparities across the board holistically to see what the economic impacts are.
Testing has been an issue throughout the country. What is the situation for Native Americans? I mean, do they have any access at all?
Well, again, there's various reports, but from most of the tribal governments, that they said that there's inadequate testing, and that there has been also some challenges, I guess, between the CDC and the Indian Health Service. That's also been exasperating that ability to reach tribes. But this seems to be a critical situation, especially as people are talking about opening up the country again. So this really needs to be looked at this micro level.
Local health departments are not identifying Native Americans as a separate group. In fact, if you look at the forms that they are filling out, Native Americans go into a column which is just labeled other. So I'm just wondering to what extent that distorts and skews the real number of people who are affected.
Well, again, data is really an important tool that we use to find out how we can assist our communities and where the gaps are in providing services. So, there's a push right now for the U.S. Census and for tribes to be heavily involved in that. And many tribal leaders are calling for Native Americans and other indigenous peoples to take part in that, so that this can help the situation. But as I mentioned previously, the data is very spotty across, and it's still just coming in. There are some reports coming out from some academic sources which are highlighting some, but again, because of the issue of indigenous peoples living on reservations and those that are living in cities, there's a gray area. And again, this is another thing that the COVID situation highlights. This is another disparity that really needs to be looked at. That's that invisibility, of indigenous peoples in the overall dialogue.
Right. Do you have any lines of communication open with the federal government?
Well, the tribal leaders themselves remember that American Indian tribes, at least the federally recognized ones, are supposed to have a government-to-government relationship with the federal government. However, when you look at the issue of state-recognized tribes, they have a very different opportunity to engage government, and that's at the state level. When you look at indigenous peoples who are not recognized, you're entering into a whole nother area where people are just not counted at all, or not being taken into consideration, other than initiatives that are focused on the general population. And because our peoples are marginalized and vulnerable, this places extra burden on the communities and our ability to help. So we reach out to, for example, maybe nonprofit agencies. We also tribal to tribal initiatives to try to make up some of these gaps that we see.
Chief Barrera, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
That's all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. You can chat with us on Twitter, that's at CGTN America, or join us on Facebook. We're at facebook.com/CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu. Thanks for being with us.
Whether it's about your education, the home you live in, or the items you buy, your money has a story to tell. Because every business story is a human story. Global Business.